Mark Weisbrot is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Mr. Weisbrot, there are stories this morning about Hugo Chavez traveling to Colombia. What's the purpose of this trip?
Well, he's trying to get the release of some hostages that are held by the guerrilla group, the FARC, and they've been held for quite a long time now. And so he has offered to mediate before for some time, but this is the first time that his offer has been accepted by both sides. So it's going to be tough, but he thinks it's worth a try. The Colombian government thinks it's worth a try, and so that's what's going to happen.
What's behind his reason to get involved?
Well, you know, Chavez, first of all, you know, he's always maintained very good relations with the government of Colombia, even though that government is more of a right-wing government, and of course one of the few in the region that's aligned with the United States. But President Chavez and President Uribe have always had a very good relationship, and I think if you know anything about Chavez, that makes sense. His whole philosophy is one of kind of Pan-American nationalism, and so the last thing he wants is a fight between the two countries, or the war. They have a 1,300-mile border, and he doesn't want it spilling over, as it already does sometimes. And it's interesting because, you know, here in the United States, you get a very one-sided view of Chavez and Venezuela from the media. It's very much like what we had in the run-up to the Iraq War, where, you know, the government wanted us to believe that there was some relationship between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, because they wanted to invade Iraq, and so 70% of the people here actually believed it. And so our government is very much against the government of Venezuela, and the Bush administration has pursued a policy of regime change. They're really supporting a military coup, paying the people who were involved in it back in 2002, and other efforts to get rid of this government. So we get a very one-sided view, but if you look at Chavez more objectively, or you learn a little bit more about his government, it's actually, you know, he's pretty pragmatic about a lot of things. You know, he has this bellicose rhetoric with respect to the United States, but that's actually because our government supported a military coup against him, has been trying to get rid of him. You can imagine what people would feel like here if a foreign government was trying to do that to us.
And is the opinion between our country, within the country itself, of Venezuela and Latin America, is his opinion higher because of the economic promises that he makes to the people?
Oh yeah, I mean, he's pretty well liked in a lot of Latin America. It depends on the country, because, you know, in countries that have media like ours, people tend to believe what they hear in the media. But anywhere where people get any kind of independent reporting, they tend to like him. And he has very good relationships with, you know, with Brazil, for example, with President Lula da Silva of Brazil, with President Kirchner of Argentina. All the left of, you know, most of South America now is governed by left-of-center governments. Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Tabre Vázquez in Uruguay. And so all of these, you know, relationships are very good. In fact, they're right now negotiating to create a new bank, the Bank of the South, with 7 South American governments, the ones I just mentioned, plus Uruguay.
The bank was...
Paraguay, actually, is the other one.
The bank was part of the topic that he made in a recent speech. It was on the 15th of this month. I want you to listen to part of that speech and also get you a little bit of reaction from it.
And do you know how much we have? We have $30 billion in the hands of Fonden. That gives us a tremendous amount of financial independence. So much so that we have even helped other countries, and we do so with our soul. We've helped Argentina by buying bonds, by helping Argentina free itself from the burden of the external debt and the International Monetary Fund. Bolivia, we've signed a bond purchase agreement to help Bolivia. We have become a country that finances other countries. And this is valid. And this, ambassadors, might be the first steps towards our proposal of the Bank of the South. We've already agreed with President Kirchner, President Morales, and President Correa not to wait any longer to establish that bank. And in the next few months, we were talking about November, we'll be creating the Bank of the South here in the city of Caracas, where its main headquarters will be. A bank for the countries of the South.
Mr. Weisbrot, if you can give some context.
Sure, this is very important because, again, here it's portrayed, well, this is Chavez's project, Chavez's funding, but actually that's not true. There's 7 countries that I just named that are involved. Most of the funding will not come from Venezuela, so it's very much a collective project among the countries, including Brazil and Argentina and the others. And so this is very important because it shows what's happening in the region. You know, it's not, you know, here in Washington, everything is viewed through this kind of Cold War perspective. It's Bush against Chavez. And what you see here is it's not, that's actually not an accurate picture at all. What's really happening is these countries are becoming more independent. For the first time really in 150 years, this region is more independent of the United States than Europe is in terms of its policies, foreign policy. And one of the main reasons this is happening has to do with finance, because the main avenue of influence that the United States had in Latin America, even though it's sometimes intervened militarily and through the CIA and things like that, the main influence has been through control over credit. So you had this system where the International Monetary Fund would be the gatekeeper, kind of the head of the whole creditors cartel. If the country didn't agree to the conditions set down by the IMF, they wouldn't get money from the World Bank, from the Inter-American Development Bank most of the time, from the rich country governments, including the United States. And so the United States had enormous power to say, this is what you're going to do. And this was part of the reforms, the economic reforms that were implemented over the past 25 years. We're done with this kind of pressure very often, where they said, you know, and they adopted whole new policies. They opened up their countries to indiscriminately to trade, to investment flows. They privatized tens of billions of dollars of state-owned industries. They did a whole series of reforms. They abandoned the development strategies that they had in the past. And the results, of course, were terrible. The growth rate of, just looking at growth and forgetting about poverty and distribution and everything else that most people usually talk about, if you just look at economic growth, in the last 26 years, it's been the worst in really more than a century in Latin America. So this is why you have all these left governments. And this is why Chavez has played such a big role in the region, because by providing an alternative source of credit with none of these policy conditions attached, he's really completely undermined the influence of the United States in the region. And so that's the main reason why our government has so little influence now as compared to just even 5 or 6 years ago.
You spoke about the impression of, you know, our country versus their country, their president versus our president, but when he makes the fiery rhetoric that he does in some of his speeches, when you take the speech that he did to the UN, isn't there a case that, you know, that's exactly the case, that it is our government versus theirs?
Well, it is in many ways, but that, I think, was not a confrontation of Chavez's choosing, or, you know, it's not something that really can be pinned on him. Again, you know, the United States government has been trying for several years to undermine and destabilize and get rid of his government. They supported this military coup in 2002. They continued to support several attempts, either tacitly or overtly, to get rid of the government through oil strikes, for example. And when they boycotted, the opposition boycotted the election in December 2005, our government tacitly supported that as well. And right now, they're still giving millions of dollars to opposition groups in Venezuela, which they won't even, our government is doing that now, they won't disclose anymore who they're giving it to. So we don't even know how much they're doing now. But it's very clear that they want to get rid of this government, and that's a serious threat. I mean, the United States has gotten rid of an awful lot of democratically elected governments historically in Latin America.
Mark Weisbrot, our guest, to talk about Hugo Chavez, his influence in Latin America. And again, the numbers will be on your screen if you want to call and ask him questions. Our first question for you comes from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I think you got a very smart guest on. He's exactly right. He's right on the money. This policy has to change. I want to make one statement. There's been, it's hundreds of empires that have ruled the world one time or another, and all of them have fallen, and they're fallen the same way. They got too powerful, and they try to control the world through the same way that we are doing, by supporting good dictators, bad dictators. I look back at our history, and we supported Saddam, we supported bin Laden. This guy in Pakistan, he's a dictator. We're going to have to get rid of him sooner or later. We got no policy, and we need to look at ourselves and take care of our nation. But we're going to go down the same road as all other great empires. And the way they fell is all the other countries ganged up on them and brought them down. And I can see that happening to the United States now.
Well, I think I mean, certainly this is the way it's looked at in Latin America, that the United States has an empire. And the political developments that we've been talking about just now are seen in that light, in the sense that the United States is losing, in a sense, this empire in Latin America. And, you know, I think it does explain something about U.S. foreign policy. For example, we have this problem with oil states. We're about to, you know, possibly have another confrontation with Iran. At least that's, the White House is talking more and more like that. And then there was, of course, the war in Iraq. And people often think here, really across the political spectrum, that this is because we need oil for our cars, you know, for gasoline for our cars, and we need the oil. But if you look at it closely, it's really not the oil per se that leads us into conflicts with oil states. And Venezuela is another oil state, of course, and that's, I think, one of the main reasons why our government is focusing so much on Venezuela. And I think it's because oil states tend to have influence. They have an independent source of income, and they tend to want to be players in the region, as Iran wants to be, for example, right now. And so what our government has traditionally done is try to control those states to some degree, and to make sure that they don't pursue their own independent policies. And that is what leads to the conflict. I think if we, you know, became self-sufficient in energy, which I think would be a great thing for the United States, I don't think that it would necessarily change our foreign policy all that much. And I think you can see this in Latin America very clearly now. They lost control over one major oil state, which is Venezuela, and it doesn't hurt us at all. We're still getting half of the oil that Venezuela produces, but it did change the whole dynamic between Latin America and the United States. They basically lost their influence in South America and much of Latin America.
Brighton, Michigan, for our guest.
Yes, Mr. Weisbrot. I was struck by your initial statement that Mr. Chavez is pragmatic. I'd remind you that the leaders of the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union and the current leaders of China are pragmatic people. They are not free, democratic, peace-loving individuals. They're pragmatic, and they understand that standing up to the United States with words is one thing. Chavez is pragmatic in that he bought, what, a $4 billion deal with the Soviet Union with Russia to purchase weapons. You mentioned the American empire in South America. I'm not quite sure what our empire down there is. If I were seeking an empire, I certainly wouldn't look south. But I do have one question. You stated that we supported the military coup, or the coup against Chavez, but you just simply stated that as most people of your view do, without any support.
Well, sure, I'm happy to support that. I didn't bring the documents with me, but you can get them on the website. In fact, you can even find them. I posted them as a link to a column that I wrote about it. But the major documentary evidence we have, well, first of all, they openly supported, the administration openly supported the coup when it happened. That's in all the media. But more than that, the State Department was ordered to do, by the Senate, to do an investigation, an internal investigation, so it wasn't a real one, but it did turn up, and it's in the Office of the Inspector General report, that the U.S. government did fund people who were involved in the coup. They acknowledged that. And more than that, also the CIA documents released a year or two ago, again, those are also on the web, showed that the United States had advanced knowledge of the coup, pretty much knew how it was going to happen as well. And, but when the coup happened, so even though our government had full knowledge of what was happening, if you look at the statements from the White House and the State Department, they pretended that they didn't know it was a coup at all. They gave the official line of the opposition there, which was that this was just a response to people being shot in the street by the government. It turns out they weren't shot by the government anyway. But the point is they lied about the coup, and they also went around and tried to get other governments to support it. So that's what we know for sure. I mean, those are the things that are in the documents. The the attempt to solicit support from other governments was testimony from those other governments, including the former foreign minister of Mexico. But all the rest is in our own government documents. So this is a very strong case of actual involvement in the coup.
Altamont Springs, Florida.
Good morning, gentlemen. I wanted to ask Mr. Weisbrot to what extent, if any, President Chavez has subjugated and ignored the Constitution in order to remain in power for as long as he possibly can. And one quick comment, Mr. Weisbrot, I think that you should perhaps change your tone to one that the American people, or at least the U.S. government for certain, shouldn't interfere in the affairs of others. We tend to do that clearly. The CIA also takes steps in order to ensure that our interests, whatever they decide they may be at that high level, are protected around the world.
Well, I'm not sure about the last comment. I mean, I don't think that most people in the United States don't really feel that we should intervene in the affairs of other countries. The government is a separate story, but I don't think that our government necessarily represents the people of the United States when it supports coups or against democratically elected government, or intervenes in other ways, including, invasions.
Mr. Chavez did mention the Constitution in his speech. Could you give some backstory?
Yes. So the other question about the Constitution, no, the government is doing this, people can agree or disagree on term limits and whether there should be. They don't have them in most of Europe, England, France, Germany.
And what is Mr. Chavez calling for?
Well, it's not just him. I mean, he has to, he wants to remove the term limits that are in the Constitution now, but it has to be done through the process of the Constitution. So that means that first the Congress has to approve it, and then it has to be approved by a referendum. So where everyone votes, and there will be a full campaign, and of course the media in Venezuela is still dominated by the opposition. So that voice will be more than heard against it, and it will be it'll be up to the Venezuelans to decide. And of course, that doesn't make Chavez president for life or anything. It just removes the term limits. I mean, we have term limits in the United States. Our term limits were enacted as a constitutional amendment as a direct response to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected for 4 terms. And
what's Mr. Chavez's argument for removing the term limits?
He doesn't, he just doesn't think they're necessary, and he hasn't made I don't think he's made a big philosophical argument out of it, but I think you can go either way on it. Personally, I don't think term limits are all that great. I think in some circumstances they're a good thing. In other times, you have good leadership, and people want to keep it. It is a restriction, after all, on the right of voters to elect whoever they want. So in some countries, they're going to choose to have him, and others they don't. But you know, again, this is the problem with the media. They're trying to make it look like he's making himself president for life, and all he's doing is proposing that the people get to vote on whether or not there should be term limits. And then I have to respond to the other callers too, by the way, make comparisons to China and the former Soviet Union. Venezuela is a democratic country. In fact, the head of the OAS, who has sometimes supported, the Bush administration against Chavez, just said this in July. He said, democracy is very much enforced in Venezuela. That was an exact quote. That was not reported anywhere in the U.S. media. But again, it's true. If you go there, you can see there's complete freedom of speech, assembly, the press. Again, the media is much more oppositional to the government than it is here in the United States. And so this is a democracy. Whether you like Chavez or you don't like him, those are the facts.
Kansas City, good morning.
Good morning. Just a quick comment. I felt like it was a weak answer about changing the term limits. And I'd also like to mention this gentleman has painted the United States and our president as a country that is very devious, and it really hurts me as an American that I know that a lot of things happen with the government, but this is a and then also I'm wondering about President Chavez's is he when he takes over the other companies? This is a democratic. You say it's a democracy. Do democracies take over other companies that came in, developed the oil, and did this sort of thing, and then he just takes it away? I mean, that none of this jives.
Well, yes, democracies do nationalize industries. I mean, the oil industry in Venezuela was nationalized in 1976. And, of course, there are a lot of there still remain nationalized industries in Europe, for example. These are democracies, too. So the process of what I think what the caller is referring to is that in the last couple of years, the government of Venezuela has renegotiated the contracts with major foreign oil companies in order to get what was required by law in Venezuela, a majority stake in those companies. And most of the oil companies did accept the new terms, and two of them, Exxon Mobil was one, did not accept it, and they will be compensated for their assets. In fact, there's been no expropriation in Venezuela without compensation, and that compensation has been accepted and accepted willingly by the companies that have the few companies, I should say, that have been nationalized.
About one more minute. Buffalo, New York, you're the last call.
Yes, Mr. Weisbrot, those of us who have taken the time to study Venezuela would agree with you 100%. But if I ask the average American, Joe Sixpack, out there in the street, what do they think of Hugo Chavez and the current government of Venezuela, I think you would agree that the vast, vast majority of Americans would say he's a dictator, he's a despot, blah, blah, blah. Now, that leads me to my question. The American media, almost right down the line, has portrayed Hugo Chavez and his government that way. Now, to me, that's very frightening. That's almost, it's almost at the level of a Joseph Goebbels control of the media. Would you comment on this lockstep media that seems to reflect right-wing policy?
Yes, I think it's a very good question, and it also goes to the question of the previous caller about, American foreign. I think, I made the comparison at the beginning to the reporting in the run-up to the Iraq War, where people were truly deceived about this idea that there was some relationship between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, and it enabled the war to take place. And you can see how serious. We have, 4,000 U.S. Troops killed already, and and a million, actually, Iraqis are dead because of this war that never should have happened. So it has very serious consequences. I think the reporting on Venezuela is even worse because it's not checked by as much of a counterbalance. During the run-up to the Iraq War, you had people in the streets, you had enough citizens who were concerned that they forced a little bit of coverage of the other side into the media, and you don't have that so much with Latin America and Venezuela in particular, so you do get an extremely one-sided view, and it is very unfortunate. I mean, it's a disservice to the people, obviously, of the United States, and it does lead to, it can lead to conflict as well. Because we don't really get to hear the truth of what's going on.
There were a couple of books coming out on Hugo Chavez today in the New York Times Book Review, and the reviews were written by an Alexandra Starr, formerly of the Organization for American States. Not so much about the book review, but a statement that she makes that I want you to respond to. She says, Chavez indisputably has forged a strong bond with his country's poorest citizens, but his standing may be more dependent on the price of oil than he would like to admit.
Yeah, that's kind of the fantasy of our government and, of course, the opposition. In Venezuela, that this is all an oil boom that's about to go bust. And, you know, of course, I write mostly about economics, and so I have written about this, and you can find my most recent paper on our website at cepr.net, where I look at this. But just to give you an idea, the price of oil would have to fall a lot more than anybody is projecting for the Venezuelan government to run into trouble. They've budgeted for oil at about half of what it came in, about $29 a barrel, for this year, and similarly for last year. And so they've been kind of careful about that. They have, you know, over $40 billion in reserves. They have a low foreign debt. They can borrow on international markets. So it would take a crash in oil prices again that nobody would predict and seems extremely unlikely, and it would have to stay down for quite a long time as well, the oil prices, for Venezuela to really run into trouble.
Mark Weisbrot, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Pedro.
Coming up on our program tomorrow, we will take a look at employer-employee relations with Randall Johnson of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Bill Samuel of the AFL-CIO. And then we will take a look at poverty in the United States. Joining us, Mark Greenberg of the Center for American Progress. We will be also joined by Ron Haskins of Brookings Institution. The Washington Journal starts tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., and we will see you then.